and I want to welcome to our esteemed guests from all parts of the world today. Our public gallery, and I think a lot of people here have shown a huge amount of commitment in relation to this issue. And Minister, this debate has gone on for decades. In my living memory, the default position of the state has been to continue to criminalise and incarcerate people for drug use. And wherever you believe the moral and ethical issues around drug use, we've had 6 decades of this. Ireland has one of the highest drug-related deaths in Europe. Our prisons are overflowing in relation to addiction issues, in relation to the drug kind of industry. So you would think, after 6 decades of failure, that things will have moved on. And this debate has evolved, I think, including myself. I think most people are more educated, they're more informed, and they're more enlightened in relation to what has gone before and what needs to happen now. Because, as I said before, imprisoning people, criminalising people, stigmatising people doesn't work. And we've seen that in other jurisdictions. So it's important to move on. And I think many, many people are questioning the logic of actually our anti-drug laws in the first place. These were written in the 1970s. The war on drugs was in its full throes. And the war on drugs, if you really kind of scratch the surface, was kind of racism concentrated. It was class concentrated in relation to poor people, in relation to people of colour. But that's for another debate, for another time. And gladly, Minister, public opinion has progressed and has moved on. They don't have all these hang-ups that others have in relation to discriminating people. And the Citizens' Assembly have projected that we need to move on from the status quo, because the status quo simply doesn't work. And the Citizens' Assembly made a lot of recommendations, including non-legislative recommendations in relation to treatment, in relation to how we approach this issue. But it also made a fundamental stance around criminalising people. And in order to do that, Minister, you have to change the law. As simple as that. That's the way our party would see it, and many others. Including the Citizens' Assembly making its recommendations around stop criminalising people, the Justice Committee had a very, very good report here 15 months ago. And it was a very kind of damning indictment of our criminal justice system, of continuously criminalising people. And my interpretation, and many other people's interpretation, is that they advocated a different model of a different approach in relation to how we approach drug use and misuse. We all understand that. And that went further about, stop criminalising people. Looking at different kind of models and jurisdictions and so forth. So, just to get on to what this bill is about. This bill is a very kind of moderate bill. I'm the first one to say that. We're the first one to say that. We think hopefully it's a precursor to full regulation of cannabis. So it's a kind of a moderate bill in relation to the simple possession of cannabis for personal use. That's up to 7 grams. And anybody has asked me, well, why 7 grams? Look at Luxembourg, look at what Malta have done. They have kind of stipulated 7 grams. Small amount, but for their simple possession. So, if that was legislated tomorrow, somebody with that amount of cannabis would not be prosecuted, would not have to go through the criminal justice system, and so forth. So, in that kind of guise, then you would think that would make sense. You would think that would make sense. But, sense, I think, sometimes got to the door. Now, the adult caution scheme was introduced in 2020. And that is extremely arbitrary. That is on the discretion of an individual guard in relation to those that they may find in possession of small amounts of drugs. So since 2020, the amount of people that have been charged and brought through the criminal justice system has exploded. It hasn't gone down. It has gone to over 6,500 people are brought to a court in relation to simple possession. So it's very arbitrary, and do individual guards use their discretion? I think in most cases they don't, and it shouldn't be up to an individual guard. The law should change in relation to, simple possession, and that's what, our bill is about, and that's what the Citizens' Assembly have made its recommendations on. And it's very arbitrary. People being brought before a criminal court for small amount of drugs simply doesn't work. Doesn't work. If somebody can tell me how it actually does work, I'm all ears. But we've been all ears for the last 6 decades, and that doesn't work. So I think a better system, Minister, is decriminalisation of the person. We're still in the kind of the paradigm of drugs being still illegal. We're not talking about making things legal here in relation to this bill. We're talking about decriminalisation of the person, and that's important. So the kind of, I suppose, the elephant in the room, Minister, is the black market. The black market, which is hugely profitable, and the people that control the black market are the criminal gangs that are very violent, and they will use all sorts of intimidation in relation to communities across the country. But largely they control the black market. And you have this kind of ridiculous system that we have in place that control drugs that are supposed to be controlled by the state are not controlled by the state at all. They're controlled by the black market. So why allow that to happen? And why let that kind of vacuum still constantly exist in relation to this issue? So our bill, Minister, is very moderate. I understand that the government are putting a timed amendment in relation to that. That's very disappointing, I have to say. Very disappointing. I mean, the ink is hardly dry on the Citizens' Assembly's report, and you're saying that there needs to be a timed amendment in relation to this. I mean, this is a test of the will of your government in relation to this issue. I'm not naive, Minister, right? I'm convinced there is, well, I know, there's members of your government that are bitterly opposed to the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. They want the status quo to exist. And even today, a number of doctors have come out in relation to trying to, disinformation about the bill that we're putting. Our bill's not about legalisation, it's about decriminalising the person if they choose to use cannabis. These kind of doctors that have equated, yesterday, 7 grams of cannabis to 4 bottles of vodka. Now hold on. 4 bottles of vodka will kill you. And not only kill you, it'll kill your family as well. You're talking about 7 grams of cannabis with 4 bottles of vodka. Are they joking, are they? Are they actually serious? So this is the kind of level of discourse and debate that we're kind of up against here. These number of doctors want, obviously, the status quo to continue. That's what they're saying. And the status quo doesn't work. As I said, the Citizens' Assembly, the Justice Committee have stipulated that the status quo does not work. Right? And the interpretation that most of us got from the Citizens' Assembly is that things need to move on through non-legislative kind of issues and legislative change around the Misuse of Drugs Act. Because this is where it's all at in relation to that kind of that legislation. So it's not, as these doctors have stated, it's not anti-health by any means. We're pro-people. Anti-drugs laws, Minister, are anti-people. They've always been, incarcerating people, criminalising people, stigmatising people. That's what the last 6 decades have been all about. So we want to kind of dismantle that. And we want to give people, a choice, and we want to stop stigmatising people, stop kind of marginalising people, and give people a right to exist without criminal sanction. And that's what this bill is about today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Lasky and Corla. And firstly, I really want to thank Gino for all the work he's done on this issue, on this bill. And those who have gone before him, I think Ming Flanagan is somewhere in the gallery, but also all the campaigners, many of whom are here, who have been pushing on this issue for a long time, trying to get us in the direction of social progress. I've been in here now almost 10 years, incredibly, and I think I've learned a thing or two about how the establishment politicians react to questions of social change. And there seems to be some things that are just like truisms. That is always the case. One is that they lag behind the population. Another is that if the opportunity presents itself to kick the can down the road, they will take it, they will kick that can as far as they possibly can. And third is that they adopt the language of change, of progress, well before, if they ever, actually adopt policies which represent progress and change. And unfortunately, all three are on display here from the reaction of the government and will be on display in the course of the debate. So it's clear the people are ahead of the politicians. That's what the Citizens' Assembly shows. Citizens' Assembly is very, very clear in terms of a proper health-led approach, in terms of decriminalisation. The Citizens' Assembly came within one vote of recommending legalisation of cannabis, which I think would be the right thing to do in terms of actually taking this out of the control of the criminal gangs, having proper state control and regulation and so on. But they're very clear in terms of decriminalisation, and yet the state is dragging its heels and the politicians are dragging their heels. Secondly, kicking the can down the road. That's what the government plans to do today. So you're going to have a timed amendment and the government's going to say very reasonably, sure, we have the Citizens' Assembly, we need to take time to consider the Citizens' Assembly, we need to take that time and therefore let's just delay this and say it passes in 9 months' time. Well, what else happens in 9 months' time? I tell you what else happens in 9 months' time, a general election. Maybe in 10 months' time, 11 months' time, at most in 13 months' time. So what the government's amendment, if it passes, guarantees is that this bill is not going to pass before there's an election and before there's a new government. That's what the government's amendment is actually about, is avoiding taking a decision. All we're asking here is to take the decision, in principle, to say we're going to decriminalise the possession of small amounts of cannabis for personal use. That's all. It's a tiny step in the direction we need to go. It's nowhere near even the implementation of the full Citizens' Assembly recommendations, agreeing in principle today that this is the direction that we should go, and yet the government wants to kick the can down the road and not to do it. Thirdly, the rhetoric. I mean, it is interesting, and it's a sign of the pressure that the government is under, that for the last maybe 2 years or so, if you ask about drugs in here, the government comes back and says, we're in favour of a health-led approach. We're in favour of a health-led approach. They've gotten the idea that this is the language to use. But there's no aspect of a health-led approach in terms of what the government actually does. What does a health-led approach look like? There's two aspects. One is stop criminalising people for taking drugs. And the other is invest in the health services, invest in tackling inequality, in tackling deprivation, in tackling trauma, invest in addiction services, invest in the health services to actually deal with problem drug use, drug abuse and drug addiction. But that's also not happening. So the government just has the language of a health-led approach while continuing with a war on drugs criminalisation type approach, proven by the fact that there's over 12,000 recorded offences for possession of an illicit drug for personal use in 2022. Possession of an illicit drug for personal use was 70% of all drug offences for 2022. And it was summed up by Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, being asked recently about an injection centre in Cork. And he made some kind of positive noises about being open for it, but then he raised what I think was meant to be some sort of profound question about the ethics of the state doing this, and would the state become responsible for people for what happened to them if they took drugs in an injection centre authorised by the state. Just like complete nonsense. He has to know it's complete nonsense. It has nothing to do with a health-led approach. Of course there's no obligation, no legal liability on the state or whatever. But again, it's just obfuscation, sitting on the fence, avoiding actually taking the change. To come to the basics, very quickly, this is a question of whether we continue down the road of a failed war on drugs, or else recognise the reality that you will not stop people taking drugs as a result of criminalisation, and instead you need to invest in the services, in tackling inequality and so on, to make sure that you're allowing people to take drugs in a safe manner if they choose to do so, and minimising the dangers of drug abuse and drug addiction. We need to pass this. We need to reject the government amendment.
Thanks, Lascian Corla, and can I just commend Deputy Gino Kenny for his leadership on this critically important social issue in our society. And it is depressing, to be honest, the lack of leadership, the lack of courage of the government that yet again they want to kick a key issue of social change and just recognising social reality down the road yet again instead of doing the right thing. And particularly now when you have the Citizens' Assembly having made the recommendations. I mean, while the wider issue, and we're very clear about this and straight up, we believe in the legalisation of drugs and the regulation of them. Because we think criminalisation has failed, and failed disastrously. Disastrously. It has done far more damage to our society than would legalising and regulating it properly. And it's doing it every single day. It is criminalising huge numbers of young people, effectively whole generations of young people, doing particular damage, that criminalisation, to some of the poorest and most deprived communities, to people who are medically vulnerable, people with mental health issues and so on. It is doing extraordinary damage. And critically, it has spawned a massive violent criminal underground that is a direct result of criminalisation. I mean, it is so obvious to me that if you criminalise something that huge numbers of our population do, whether you like that thing or not, then at a stroke, all of those people become criminals. Some of them will end up in in prison, in court, enormous amount of police resources, of court resources, but even those who don't end up in court are operating in a criminal underworld, vulnerable to the criminals that run it and all that goes with that. And I mean, I don't know what the government are going to say in response to this. No doubt they will say that there, can be negative consequences of drug use, addiction, impacts on mental health, and so on. And I don't claim to be an expert, but I don't think there is a single thing that you could say about the adverse negative impact of cannabis use that you couldn't say 10 times over about alcohol use, which does far more damage to our society. Far more damage. But it would be a foolish government indeed who thought the answer to the problems with alcohol abuse, the violence, the domestic abuse, the addiction, who would say, let's criminalise it. Because of course that was tried and it was a disaster. It led directly to the growth of the mafia and the criminal underworld in the United States, for which the United States is still paying a very, very bitter price. Indeed, it glamorises, effectively, I mean, whatever you may think about it, it glamorises drug use as being part of a sort of mysterious criminal underworld. It is directly counterproductive. Even if your objective is to reduce drug use, and certainly all of us have the objective of reducing drug harm and addiction, it is directly counterproductive. It makes the situation far worse. It stigmatises people. It leaves people with criminal records that impact on the rest of their life in many cases, limits their life choices, and so on. And indeed, you could say many of the same things about prescription drugs, which are regulated. So it makes no sense whatsoever. And the government should cop on and show a bit of moral leadership and political leadership and allow this very, very modest bill. But we hope we can also open up that wider debate. The strategy of criminalisation and the strategy, frankly, of political cowardice has been a disastrous failure, and working class areas in particular, although not exclusively, have paid a bitter price for the criminalisation approach that this government and previous governments have followed. It has to end. The government has to wake up to reality.
Very much, Last Ken Corla, and I very much welcome the opportunity to update the. I very much